罗马书第5章，我们来到第8讲，讲义的63页。我们前面讲到罗马书第5章第12节最后那几个字，因为众人都犯了罪。有人认为这个就是指每一个人都犯了罪，好像罗马书第3章23节，世人都犯了罪。穆里坚持说不对，有5个理由众人都犯了罪，在第5章12节不是指每一个人具体的罪。现在我们来考虑第二个观点。第二个观点呢是奥古斯丁主义的观点，就是众人都犯了罪是指众人都败坏了，生下来就有原罪。Hence the thought would be， 所以呢，根据奥古斯丁主义的思想呢的理解呢，这个意思就是说 that death penetrated all because all derived from Adam a corrupt nature。 死临到众人是因为众人全人类都从亚当领受了一个败坏的本性人性。 And the ground upon which condemnation and death wield their universal sway is that all, even infants, are afflicted with this hereditary taint。 那么定罪和死在全人类掌权的根据呢，是因为全人类包括婴孩都遭受了这个遗传的污秽。 This view stands on more biblical ground than the foregoing。 这个观点呢，比前面所讲的柏拉图主义的观点是比较有圣经的根据的。第64页 ，It is true that all are by nature defiled and depraved by sin。 没有错，全人类每一个人的本性都是因为罪的缘故被玷污了，被败坏了。And this of itself does entail universal condemnation and death。 而这个我们的败坏本身呢，是带来这个定罪和死的后果的。But there are also good reasons for thinking that this is not the sin the apostle has in mind when he says in that all sinned。 但是我们有足够的理由相信呢，这个并不是保罗所说因为众人都犯了罪的意思的。There are two conclusive objections。 我们有2个强而有力的反对奥古斯丁主义的解释的理由。Number one， 第一个反对的理由 ，It is inconsistent with the repeated affirmations of verses 15 to 19。 这个与第15节到第19节多次所坚持的是不一致的。就 the fact that 那15到19节坚持什么呢？ The condemnation and death came to reign over all by the reason of the one sin of the one man, Adam。 定罪和死临到全人类，是因为一个人亚当的一次的过犯。And this sustained emphasis upon the one trespass of the one man， 保罗多次的坚持一个人的一次的过犯 does not comport with the notion of original sin or hereditary depravity， 不符合原罪或者遗传性的败坏的概念的。The latter cannot by any means be characterized as the one sin of the one man。 遗传的败坏不可能被理解为一个人一次犯罪的意思。65页，第二个反对的理由 Number 2， It is inconsistent with the parallel which is drawn in this passage as a whole。 这个遗传的败坏呢，是与整段经文12到21节所做的比较是不一致的。反过来讲，称义 We are not justified on the ground that we are made inherently righteous。 我们被称义不是因为上帝使我们成为本质上的义人了。这个是另外一个很大的题目要讨论的。参考加尔文基督教要义卷3，讲到称义呢很长的一段，他怎么反对 Osiandam。 But if we are condemned and suffer that because we are depraved and inherently sinful, the only analogy or parallel to this would be that we are justified because we become inherently holy。 但是假如我们是因为败坏本质上有罪，所以我们要遭受到定罪和死的话，那么这个只有用这个方法，就用这个来做比较，就是说我们被称义是因为我们成为本质上圣洁的人。 And that is plainly not Paul's doctrine。 很明显的，这个不是保罗所教导的教义。 We are justified and attain to life by the obedience and righteousness of the one, namely Jesus Christ。 我们是因为一个人 耶稣基督这个人的顺服和义而称义的生命的，不是因为我们成为本质上的义人。If neither the actual transgressions of men nor the depravity with which we all are afflicted will comport with the teaching of this passage， 假如众人具体的犯罪和每一个人所遭受到的败坏都不能符合这段经文的教导， the question still remains， 我们仍然要面对这个问题的就是 What sin is in view when Paul says in that all sinned？ 那保罗在讲因为众人都犯了罪，他是指什么罪呢？第66页 The following considerations lead to one conclusion。 下面我们会指出好几方面的考虑，是导致一个结论，三方面的考虑导致一个结论，就是 that for some reason the one sin of the one man Adam is accounted to be the sin of all。 一个人亚当的一项的罪被归算为全人类的罪。第一个理由 Number one， It is unquestionable that the universal sway of death is represented in verse 12 as based on the fact that all sinned。 第一个理由，毫无疑问的，死在全人类身上作王，根据一件事，就是众人都犯了罪。Number two， 第二个理由 In verses 15 to 19， 从第15节到第19节 It is asserted with equal clearness， 保罗同样那么清楚的宣告 that the universal reign of death is based on the one trespass of the one man Adam。 死在全人类中作王，是根据一个人亚当的一次的过犯。And in like manner, universal condemnation is based on the same fact of the one sin of the one man。 同样的，全人类被定罪也是根据同一个件事实，就是一个人亚当的一次的过犯。第二个理由 Number three， 第三个理由 We cannot suppose that the apostle is dealing with two different facts when in verse 12 the death of all is grounded upon the sin of all, and when in the subsequent verses death of all is grounded upon the one sin of the one man。 我们不可能认为保罗在第12节跟后文呢是指两件不同的事实。12节众人的死是根据众人的罪，后面呢几节呢众人的死是根据一个人的一次的犯罪。保罗不可能再讲两件不同的事实。 The whole passage is a unit， 整段经文是一个整全的单元。67页 The central strand is the analogy that exists。 所以保罗整段经文的思路的一条的核心的线是一项的比较 between the passing of condemnation and death to all by the sin of the one and the passing of justification in life to the justified by the righteousness of Christ。 这个比较就是一方面呢，因为一个人的罪传给全人类定罪和死；另一方面呢，因为基督的义把称义和生命传给那些被称义的人。Furthermore， 再者 Verse 12 is an unfinished comparison。 第12节是一个没有完成的比较。 It would be out of the question to suppose that the apostle, dealing as he is with the universal reign of death, should so explicitly and repeatedly affirm in the succeeding verses something quite different from that which he affirms in an unfinished introduction to his argument。 我们不可能想象呢，使徒保罗当他讨论死在全人类作王的时候呢，在后面的15到19节呢，多次的讲的是跟前面12节所讲的是不同的，不可能的。If verse 12 were a context of its own， 假如第12节是独立的一段，一个 context， and if there were an obvious transition from one subject to another， 假如第12节结束之后，很明显的保罗从讨论一个题目转到另外一个题目的话呢， then we might say that in verse 12 he deals with one fact, and in verses 15 to 19， 那么我们有可能说第12节保罗讨论一件事，到了15到19节讨论另外一件事，有这个可能。We cannot posit any such transition， 但是我们不可以假设有这种的转折。 For a simple reason， 原因很简单。The verse 12 relies upon the succeeding verses to complete the subject which is introduced。第12节是要靠后面的几节来完成它引发出的所开始的题目的。68页。And finally, as noted earlier， 最后，正如我们前面已经注意到 ，verse 14 makes it impossible to interpret all sin of verse 12 as we might be disposed to interpret it if it stood apart from what follows。就算我们认为第12节是独立的一段经文呢，有了第14节，就不可能任由我们所喜欢的方法的解释众人犯了罪了。All sinned cannot mean the actual voluntary transgressions of men。众人都犯了罪，12节不可能是指每一个人具体的自愿所犯的过犯。Because if this were the case, Paul would have contradicted himself。因为若是如此的话，保罗就自我矛盾了。For these reasons, we must conclude。基于这些的原因，我们必须做这样的结论 ：that the all sinned of verse 12 and the one trespass of the one man of verses 15 to 19 must refer to the same fact or event。12节的众人都犯了罪，和第15到19节的一个人的一次的犯罪，是指同一件事实、同一个事件。And that the one fact can be expressed in terms of both singularity and plurality。同一件事实是可以用单数一个人来表达，也可以用复数众人来表达。As the sin of the one and the sin of all。同一件事，同时是一个人的罪，也是全人类的罪。And the only solution is that 唯一解决问题的方案是 that there must be some kind of solidarity existing between the one and the all。一个人和众人全人类之间肯定有某一种的认同关系 solidarity。 But the result 的结果是呢 that the sin of the one may be at the same time and with equal relevance be regarded as the sin of all。 一个人的罪同时被认为是全人类的罪，也有着同样的重要性。69页。What this solidarity is, it is not our purpose at present to determine。 那这个认同关系是什么呢？决定这个问题的答案不是我们目前在这一点上的目的。But once the fact of solidarity is appreciated， 但是我们一旦体会到这个认同关系的事实 ，then we understand why the apostle can speak of the one sin and the sin of all。 我们就会理解为什么保罗同时可以说是一个人的罪、一个过犯和全人类的罪。We must not tone down either the singularity or the universality。 不可以冲淡一个人这个单数，也不可以冲淡众人这个复数这个普世性全人类。We are now in a position to grasp the force of the comparison or correspondence implied in a continuative and so in verse 12。 现在我们可以掌握到第12节的这样 and so 这个继续性的表述所暗示的内向的比较。A comparison is instituted between the way in which sin and death entered and the way in which they became universal。 保罗这里设立一项的比较，就是罪和死如何进入到人类，和罪和死如何遍及到全人类之间有一项的比较。Adam sinned, and with sin came death. That there is an inevitable sequence。 亚当犯了罪，与罪同时来的是死，这个是一个必然的先后的次序。But the same sequence applies to all。 但是同样的次序是指全人类的。Since the sin of Adam is the sin of all， 亚当的罪既然是全人类的罪， death spreads to all as inevitably as it fell to the law of Adam and thus into the world。 亚当的罪既然是全人类的罪，那么死就必然的遍及全人类，就正如临到亚当一样。 这样子死就进入到全世界了。The immediate sequence exemplified in Adam and in the entrance of death applies also to the universal reign of death. 亚当所代表的、所显示出的马上的结果，就是罪马上进来呢，也同时用在为什么死在全人类身上做王。The solidarity existing between Adam and posterity， 亚当和他的后裔全人类之间有一个认同关系的 establishes a correspondence between that which is exemplified in the case of Adam himself and that which happens to the whole human race。 这样子呢，就设立了一个的相互相配的关系，一面是亚当他个人的经历，另一个方面就是在全人类发生的事情。Adam sinned and death entered， 亚当犯了罪，死就进入到世界了。In Adam, all sinned, and therefore death passed to all。 在亚当里，全人类都犯了罪，因此死就临到全人类。This is the force of the and so。 And so 同样的，因此就是这个意思。第71页 There is an exact parallel between what occurred in the case of Adam himself and that which occurred in the case of all。 在亚当身上发生什么事，和在全人类身上发生什么事，是有一个完全相对称的平衡性。And a parallel in this case can only be properly understood when we appreciate the solidarity in sin。 若要充分的理解这个平衡性呢，我们必须体会到亚当跟全人类在犯罪这件事情上是团结的，是在一个认同、群体认同的关系上。Paul says elsewhere, in Adam all die。 保罗在另外一处的经文哥林多前书第15章22节说，在亚当里众人都死了。 The only adequate explanation is 唯一完备的解释就是看到 that provided by Romans 5:12， that is in Adam all sin， 就是罗马书第5章12节所提供的解释，在亚当里全人类都犯了罪。 Romans 5:13 and 14， 罗马书第5章13到第14节，我们先读中文的。没有律法之先，罪已经在世上，但没有律法，罪也不算罪。然而从亚当到摩西，死就做了王，连那些不与亚当犯一样罪过的，也在他的权下。亚当乃是那以后要来之人的预像。穆里的英文翻译 For until the law, sin was in the world, but sin is not imputed when there is no law. 14. Nevertheless, death reigned from Adam until Moses, even over them that had not sinned after the likeness of Adam's transgression, who is a figure of him that was to come. 第72页 And verse 13 begins the parenthesis which interrupts the completion of the comparison of verse 12. 第13节就开始这个括弧，这括弧是中断了第12节所做的比较的。As an interruption, it must have close bearing upon something stated in the preceding verse. 作为一个中断性的经文，它必然在影响第12节所说的。And this is indicated by the conjunction for， 因此有一个连结词 for。For until the law, sin was in the world. 因为直到律法来之前，罪是在世界里的。A sin is not imputed when there is no law. 但是若没有律法，哪里没有律法呢？罪就没有归算。This verse stands in close relation to verse 14. 刚才讲的是第13节，这与第12节连结。现在来讲第13节与第14节也有密切的关系的。And the strong adversative with which the latter begins indicates， 而第14节一开始就有一个反面的用词 adversative， 这个就指出 The thought of verse 13 is preparatory to that of verse 14. 第13节的思想是为第14节铺路的，做准备的。And moves on to verse 14 as expressing what is of particular relevance to the subject. 第13节的思路就进入到第14节，第14节就表达与13节讨论的问题特别有关的一些的资料。We must not allow our minds to be diverted from this emphasis. 我们绝对不可以忽略了这方面的强调 and thus permit the primary purpose of these two verses to escape us. 这样子我们就会避开了，没有看到这两节经文主要的要旨是什么。The main thought is 这两节经文主要的思想是 Death reigned over those who did not sin after the similitude of Adam's transgression. 13、14节主要的思想是死在那些没有好像亚当那样子犯罪的人身上作王的。If this is once recognized, 我们若承认这一点 then we may ask at the outset, 我们就可以马上就问一个问题了。What bearing does that observation have on the thought of verse 12? 那么这件事情是在那些不像亚当那样子犯罪的人身上作王，跟第12节有什么关系，有什么影响呢？ The question should not be considered difficult. 我们不应该觉得这个是很艰难的问题。In verse 12, 在第12节 The doctrine of particular significance to the argument being developed is that death came to all men, not by reason of their own actual transgression or individual sin, but because of their involvement in the sin of Adam, in other words, by reason of solidaric sin. 第12节对保罗的思路跟论据最重要的教义是，死临到众人不是因为他们具体的自己的过犯或者个别的罪行，乃是因为他们在亚当的过犯上有份，换言之，是因为这个群体认同的犯罪。This thesis required in the theme of the apostle some demonstration. 保罗认为这个论点呢需要一些的证明 or at least some exemplification to make it apparent. 至少有一些的要举例，这样子让第12节的论点能够更加的明显。Hence, he inserted a parenthesis. 因此他插入了一个括弧 which would make obvious the necessity of this construction of the reason for the universality of death. 这样子呢来表达死临到全人类的理由，必须要用这个方法来说明的。And what could be more pertinent and appeal to the fact that death reigned over those who did not sin after the similitude of Adam's transgression, that is to say, over those who did not voluntarily and overtly violate an expressly revealed ordinance of God. 那与保罗的论点最有关的就是去指出这样的事实，就是那些没有好像亚当过犯那样子犯罪的人死也是在他们身上作王的。换言之，没有自愿的明知故犯一些上帝明说的命令，在那些人身上死也是作王的。第74页 Apparently there was in the background the apostles thought the other alternative. 明显的，保罗心目中有另外一种的说法，可能有可信性 which would be the only plausible one, as a rival to the doctrine he had propounded, namely the alternative that all men die because they transgress as Adam did. 与他所教导的增进的另类的说法就是说，全人类都死了，因为他们如亚当一样犯罪。换言之，柏拉修主义的解释。It was sufficient for the apostles' purpose to appeal to the fact that many died who did not sin as Adam did, and rest the case for the rejection of that other alternative on that fact. 保罗只需要诉诸一件事，就足够达到他的目的的。很多人死了，他们并没有好像亚当那样犯罪。保罗就这样根据这件事就可以结束他的论证，拒绝另外一方面的解释的。We discover therefore direct relevance of the proposition in verse 14 to the main point of verse 12. 所以我们发现呢，第14节的概念直接与第12节的主题是相关的。As a point upon his whole argument is going to turn， 保罗整个的论证都围绕着这一点。There is one further observation to be made regarding verse 14 before we turn to the other features of this parenthesis。 所以第12节还有另外一方面的观察在我们还没有转到讨论这个括弧里面其他的特点之前，我们要观察另外一个特点。It is the force of the concluding clause of verse 14， 乃是第14节最后一个从句的意义。Who is the type of the one to come？ 亚当乃是那将要来的人的预表的预象。The reference is plainly to Adam as a type of Christ。 很明显的，这里在讲的是亚当是基督的预表，亚当是预表基督的。Page 75， 第75页。The connection of this with what immediately precedes should not be overlooked。 不可以忽略这一点和前文之间的连结的。The apostle had just referred to Adam's transgression。 使徒保罗刚刚才讲过亚当的过犯。That he should in this connection have adduced the fact of Adam's typical significance and relationship。 他在这里就加上了亚当作为预表的重要性。亚当跟基督的关系呢suggests that 就暗示着 Adam's transgression provided a parallel or analogy in terms of which the reverse on the part of Christ is to be interpreted。 亚当一次的过犯呢，是用来比较基督所做的相反的事的。亚当的犯罪通过这个比较用来解释基督的顺服或者是逆行。The reverse in the case of Christ is his obedience。 基督相反的方面的事就是他的顺服。And as we shall see later， 我们在下文会看到 this is placed in antithesis to the transgression or trespass of Adam。 这个与亚当的过犯是不两立的相反的。That Paul should have introduced allusion to this fact。 保罗在这里暗指这个事实。Throws into relief the relevance of the preceding part of verse 14 to the subject, which had been introduced in verse 12。 就显出第14节上半节对12节的主题是多么的有关，对保罗整个的论证是至为重要的。It is eminently germane to the whole argument of this passage that death reigned over those who did not sin after the similitude of Adam's transgression， 就是死在那些没有好像亚当那样犯罪的人身上是做王的。For the apostle is chiefly interested in demonstrating that men are justified who do not act righteously after the similitude of Christ's obedience。 因为保罗最重要要证明的就是人称义不是因为人好像基督那样子的顺服。Hence, the appeal to this fact that death reigned over those who did not sin after the similitude of Adam's transgression has the greatest significance in the total argument of the apostle。 因此保罗诉诸这个事实呢，就是死在那些没有好像亚当那样犯罪的人身上做王呢，对保罗整个论证是极为重要的。It contributes to the proof of the assertion in verse 12。 这个就证明第12节所宣称的就是 that death penetrated to all because they were involved in Adam's sin and sinned in him and with him。 就是死临到众人，因为他们在亚当的罪上有份，他们在亚当里与亚当一同犯罪，他们在亚当里犯罪，他们和亚当一同犯罪。The concluding clause of verse 14 is therefore corroborative。 因此第14节最后一个从句呢，是保罗再加上的一个证据 and shows how germane this doctrine is to the doctrine of justification。 因此这个教义对整个称义论是多么的相关。什么教义呢？ Adam is a type of the one to come。 亚当是那将要来的人的预表。 Having thus discovered the main interest of verses 13 and 14, the other features of this parenthesis may now be considered。 我们看到第13节、14节的主旨之后呢，我们现在就可以来考虑这个括弧的其他的特点了。